say anything bad except about Jake Stringer, perhaps. We we are live. When someone comes in, then I usually put the countdown on, and that gives another half minute for people. We'll get an idea whether anyone's interested. Oh, someone's interested. Hello, YouTube. Nice to see you. All right, here comes the countdown. Hello, bird nerds. Hello, nature nuts. Hello, concerned conservationists. I'm Grant Williams. This is the Bird Emergency. It's the second Monday of the month, depending on how you count. And that means it's Monday with Holly. And that means I get to bring in the manager, Urban Birds Program at Birdlife Australia, Dr. Holly Parsons. Hello, Holly.
Hi. Hey, Grant. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. There we are. And there's our surprise guest. Not really a surprise because we flogged it to death on social media. Professor Euan Ritchie, Professor Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at Deakin University. Welcome aboard, Euan.
G'day, Grant. G'day, Holly.
Hey.
The State of the Environment Report finally made its way out on last Tuesday, and Euan was all over the airwaves with his big headphones, telling everyone how dire the report was. But hasn't been a surprise, has it, Euan?
Look, it sadly hasn't been a surprise, and I think many scientists, including myself, probably had a range of emotions when it came out. Obviously, there is, great sadness, incredible anger and frustration, I think, are important emotions as well, because we've known about these issues for decades. We've warned about them. Importantly, scientists have also suggested solutions to both basically stopping things from getting worse, but also promoting recovery. And sadly, the fact of the matter is that governments of all persuasions, from local, state, territory, and federally, have largely not done enough to address the situation. And here we are.
Can we talk a little bit about what the main points in the report were? It's broken up nicely into about 12 sections, and I'll link on the page, obviously, for people to go and read it themselves. And if you don't want to read the whole report, there's a nice PDF summary for each section. What did you think was most shocking? Let's start with you, Holly. What disturbed you most when you were reading through it?
Oh, look, it was all pretty depressing, really. I think it was probably the extent to which everything was bad. It's that everywhere you looked through the State of the Environment report, things were dire. Of course, I was sort of looking mostly at the birds, but you were looking across threatened species as a whole. Were there were significant declines. Abundance of threatened birds dropped by 60%, I think, is the stat. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen more birds and more wildlife added to threatened species lists. Yet, there's been sort of no improvements. There was very few good news stories within it. And I think that's really scary for wildlife, and it's really scary for us, because what also popped out in that report was how, of course, we are linked to our environment, and so when things are bad for our wildlife, things are really bad for us. And we've seen drops in air quality, concerns about water quality, food security, all of these issues have been highlighted in this document and, are only going to get worse unless something changes really, really rapidly.
Euan, something that I noticed, a common thread in the media response to the report, was lots of pictures of koalas and sometimes the greater glider and maybe the OBP or the gang seemed to get a good run. But nobody was tying in the issues of water security, of food security, and how that ties into so many of our major industries. I mean, anyone who is running a farm, and I noticed that both Euan and I picked similar backgrounds today, and I think because for similar reasons, let's just see. I picked it because that is a view in the Riverina area, and a lot of people think that's a healthy looking environment. Everything's fine when you look at that, but it's not. It's an awful place for most of our native creatures, be they lizards, insects, birds, and mammals. Now, Euan, your backdrop, what can you tell us about that one?
Well, my backdrop is actually a national park. So it's Undara National Park, which is about 5 hours or so northwest of Townsville. But it does abut and is surrounded by largely cattle stations. And that's pretty much the case across most of Northern Australia, that we have pockets of national parks and also quite significant areas of Indigenous protected areas as well. Military land as well, which are all conservation areas in different ways. But there's extensive areas of pastoralism, essentially. And of course, in Northern Australia, it's almost all cattle grazing. But I think your point about the problem with, water and food and so forth is a really important one. So a colleague of mine, Dana Bergstrom, she actually led a paper looking at ecosystems spanning from the tropics all the way down, in fact, to Antarctica. But one of those includes the Murray-Darling Basin, which many of us, of course, would know is the food bowl of Australia. And that is collapsing. And for a whole range of reasons. Of course, water is a big one, but also, the condition of soil, of course, land clearing and so forth. We saw the horrendous fish kills in some rivers in that area. So it's symptomatic of the fact that environments, including ones that are really, really important for our production, literally putting food on the table, are collapsing. But I think the other important thing there too is that the farming community, whether it be, livestock graziers, whether it be crops and so forth, they are being confronted by climate change and other environmental issues. They're also, in some ways, driving change. And there's a great connection between conserving biodiversity and producing food. So, we know that in many areas we have wildlife actually on private properties, including many threatened species. And we know that by having areas of native vegetation either within, farm areas or adjacent to, can actually provide benefits, not just for biodiversity, but back to production as well, through things like pollination, natural form of pest control and so forth. So again, it really just emphasizes how everything's linked together. So I would argue, we should be conserving species regardless of what we humans think. Most species, the vast majority of species have been around a lot longer than we have. They have a right to persist as much as anything else does. But we are absolutely interlinked and dependent on nature and conserving wildlife and ecosystems. And if we don't do that, we're going to be in a world of trouble.
Having looked at the report and excuse me. There we go. Having looked at the report and seeing, as expected, how bad the state of the barrier reef is, we have the tourism industry closely linked to the health of the barrier reef. We have an icon species in the koala, which is... it's now predicted to go extinct everywhere except Victoria. Right? And possibly in Victoria, because we're still harvesting their habitat at a rate that is just unfathomable, really. But why are the industries that rely on people coming to see the iconic creatures and the iconic features of the continent, not screaming their heads off. How many Japanese and Chinese tourists or French tourists are going to come here if there's no koalas? Or do people think that Australia's Zoo and Healesville Sanctuary are an adequate substitute? Holly.
Take myself off mute. Yeah, good question. You would think somewhere like the Great Barrier Reef, which, you know, is so heavily reliant on tourism, you know, the loss of that World Heritage Area is going to be economically disastrous for Queensland and for the country. In terms of koalas, it's an interesting one. I think there is probably an international perception that because you can go and cuddle them in a zoo, that they are okay. And so maybe something needs to change around that internationally there maybe isn't the pressure or the shame being put on Australia for what is happening to koala habitat, because you can still, you know, get your close cuddly photo op. I'm not sure.
Euan, you're a bit of a mammal guy. Mammal of the Year is on now. Vote now, vote often. I'll put a link to that too, by the way.
Excellent.
How many mammals are we going to lose? because we're at that stage, aren't we? That the language is dressed up that, well, they're all threatened and whatnot, but it's unstoppable for a great proportion of them unless we do certain things. So let's talk about how many we're going to lose unless we do the things that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, well, first of all, we've driven to extinction 39 mammals at a minimum since European invasion roughly 230 years ago. So, and that's by far and away the world record for mammal extinction, so nothing to be proud of. But as you point out, there are literally scores more that are classified as endangered or critically endangered combined. So we run the risk of driving even more to extinction. And so I think that's an important point, is that it's already utterly shameful and tragic what has been allowed to occur. But on current trajectory, we're well on target to drive a whole heap more of our mammals to extinction. And it's really upsetting, and it's also deeply problematic, again, for a number of reasons. So again, species should deserve to exist regardless of what we think. The vast majority of Australia's mammals, of course, are found nowhere else on Earth. So once they're gone, that's it. We know, of course, that they have incredible value for First Nations people culturally. And they, of course, have had an association with these animals for tens of thousands of years. We also know that they're incredibly important for the health of our ecosystems. So as an example, an eastern barred bandicoot, which is, you know, only about this big, tiny little animals, can dig tons of soil per year. And that increases water infiltration, seedling germination, and soil fertility. That's just one example. So, you know, we often sort of sometimes can dismiss mammals almost as being kind of cute and fairy and sort of charismatic and say, yeah, we know you're cute and cuddly, but, you know, really, let's move on. But they have these important environmental roles. Think about our bats. So in Cairns a few years ago, or in the sort of that Cairns region, 23,000 spectacled flying foxes died over a couple of days because of an extreme heat event. And that was roughly a third of the entire population of that species, now endangered as well. And that is symptomatic of extreme heat events. So we think about climate change, of course, as, you know, an increase in temperature that's kind of continuing to happen, which is a problem in itself. But linked with that, of course, are these extreme weather events, whether it's increases of temperature in several days in a row, whether it's a heavy flooding event and so forth. And we know with fruit bats, as an example, you know, grey-headed flying fox, a closely related species, some of those individuals can move 2,500 kilometres a year. And when they're doing that, they're spreading seeds and they're pollinating our forests. So as someone who does work a lot on mammals, has a lot of love for mammals, it's really upsetting to see that we are just utterly failing to take care of these animals. And the koala situation is an interesting one because they are endangered now in Queensland, New South Wales and the ACT. And yet in other areas like Victoria and in fact South Australia, Kangaroo Island, they're overabundant. And in fact, in populations they probably never were. And that's really hard to communicate to the public that in some parts of Australia, koalas absolutely are on the knife edge of extinction in terms of local extinction. In other areas, they're overabundant. And I think that really just shows how we've mismanaged the environment and species.
And a Queensland koala is vastly different to a Victorian koala.
They're much smaller.
Yes, and a lot of the Victorian koalas are now, the strongholds are in places that they were introduced to anyway. So there's issues about them being overpopulated there. But you mentioned that the eastern barred bandicoot is a cultivator, and that the grey-headed flying fox and all the flying foxes, they're pollinating plants and distributing seeds.
Yeah.
What people have to understand is that if we can't save enough intact habitat to save the mammals, we're going to lose thousands of plant species. Some of the dryandras and banksias and grevilleas and hakeas that we think of as iconic Australian plants, some of them exist only in like areas of half a square hectare in Western Australia or in Western Queensland. They might be prominent in nurseries because of their cultivation values, their ornamental values. But if they're gone, they're no longer serving the function, those desert grevilleas and whatnot, for the moths. If the moths aren't there, whatever feeds on them disappears. So we aren't communicating well enough the stuff that we all learnt in high school biology, the web of life, right? We've been able to turn away from that.
Yeah.
I want to ask you something else about a term you used, Euan, that it was shameful. Right? It's our national shame. And actually, there's another thing I want to ask you too. But do you know anyone who feels shame, who is not in the scientific community? Like if you go to have a barbecue and watch footy, how many of the people feel shame about what we've done?
A lot of people in my network feel shame, but that's probably because they're sick and tired of me banging on about wildlife and ecosystems to them. But I agree with you that I think if you asked your average Aussie, they could name sporting heroes, they could name sporting achievements, they could name a lot of sort of historical things that have happened. Again, mostly from a European perspective, I should add as well. They would not be able to name in detail what's happened to our environment. And in fact, they probably couldn't even name many of our mammals. So, I think most Aussies could name, platypus, echidna, wombat, maybe numbat, quokka, a couple of other few common species. They couldn't name, many more than that. And so we have this, I guess, ignorance, if you like, about our own species in this continent. And that compounds, of course, the fact that we're losing and driving to extinction species left, right, and centre. I'm glad that you mentioned plants, by the way, because there's more than 1,000 threatened species plants in Australia, and they're often not mentioned in the media much at all. Again, the focus is often on, the mammals and the birds and so forth because they are charismatic. But plants dominate our threatened species list. And as you mentioned, it's all about the linkages. So you're right that if plants disappear, invertebrates disappear. And if invertebrates disappear, the things that feed on invertebrates disappear, and all those processes, whether it be pollination and so forth, also break down. So we can't be just looking at single species. We need to be thinking about ecosystems and the components. I often use the analogy like a car engine. If you start tinkering in the engine and start pulling bits out and sort of playing around with them and you don't know what you're doing, your car might run for a little bit. Chances are it won't for much longer, and it might just completely break down. And that's what we're seeing, with our species and ecosystems. So I think in terms of, not just our mammals, but other species, there's a much greater role for education as well, about making Australians, and of course start in early childhood, about awareness about what we actually have in this country, what we've actually lost, but importantly, what can still be saved. It absolutely can still be saved if we change the way, the direction that we're on.
Before I jump into what we need to do, I want to pick up on that thread about the Western perspective, Euan. And one of the really interesting, and I thought strong points of the State of the Environment report was the examining the aspect of the impact on Indigenous culture and how Indigenous traditional practices could probably be much better utilised to find solutions, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Now, I want to explore that a bit, but first I want to ask the question that I'm not sure if Holly's been on a show and I've asked this before, but I reckon this is part of the problem that we have when we are talking about the environment. Let's just say, who owns the creatures, Euan?
Look, it's a great question, and I think that gets in a way to this idea of custodianship and stewardship, and clearly, broadly speaking, we're failing miserably on those. I think, the questions you raise about Indigenous knowledge and practices are really important. It was great to see in that report, Indigenous co-authors and recognition of Indigenous knowledge. Obviously, I'm a non-Indigenous person, so I don't want to speak at length about this because I'm not qualified and it's not appropriate for me to do so. But what I would say is that in Australia, we're still very much operating with a colonial mindset. That is unquestionable. And an example of that would be dingoes. So in large parts of Australia, we have fencing, including the dingo barrier fence, roughly 5,500 kilometres long, the longest continuous fence in the world. They're also building substantial cluster fences in parts of Australia. And that excludes movement of things like emus and kangaroos. Even echidnas can get caught in them and die, turtles and so forth. And we create these issues for ourselves. So Europeans came in, they've cleared vegetation, they got rid of the main predator of kangaroos, which is the dingo. Kangaroo numbers go through the roof. You end up with overabundant kangaroos in some situations. That creates problems not just for the kangaroos themselves, because they end up starving to death. That can impact the vegetation in the process and all the other species that depend on that vegetation. And so we're sort of in this vicious cycle where we're not really living sustainably with this continent, not a different continent, but the conditions that we have here, and managing it that way. And I think another important point, going back to Indigenous knowledge, is that I think we have to be careful about saying we can use Indigenous knowledge to fix this. It needs to be self-determined, and it needs to be led by Indigenous people, and including with fire. So you'll often see people saying we can solve the fire issues by using Indigenous burning practices, and that ignores the fact, that cultural burning is much more than that.
That's right, because what we've seen is we get a whole lot of parks or forestry dudes in their uniforms, driving out in their Land Cruisers, doing cultural burning. And I mean, that's deluding. We're deluding ourselves. And you're quite right, it needs to be inclusive. I might just make the point that I have tried desperately to get some Indigenous voices on to talk about this thing, and I haven't been able to get anyone to jump on yet. So I'm very, very aware of how we sometimes slip into continuing to talk in a way which is not really appropriate, even though we don't mean to, because we're not getting the other participants in the discussion. So I just wanted to get that out there. Euan, the reason I ask the question is that we have a legislative framework, we have an economic system that sidesteps this issue of who owns the creatures, the plants, the animals, the yabbies, the cicadas,
Yeah.
everything. Someone's responsible for making laws about planning, but the traditional owners, they don't own them. If we discover they have an economic value, but if we want to rescue them, we say, oh, you can use your magic and fix our problem. So does there need to be some kind of line in the sand drawn and responsibility absolutely sheeted home to somebody for, excuse the French, the fuck up? Because at the moment, nobody's responsible. The planning minister's not responsible. The environment minister's not responsible. The environment minister answers to the agriculture minister. In the state departments, the environment minister and the agriculture minister are either in the planning or the forestry or the economic development ministries. Nobody's responsible for protection.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you highlight is important in terms of accountability. And in fact, a few years ago, John Minarski, Sarah Legg, I think maybe David Lindemeyer, they wrote an article about this very issue, looking at the extinction of the Bramblecay, Melomys, Christmas Island pipistrelle, and sort of basically breaking that problem down, that no one is basically being held to account for what's happening. And so I think it's difficult to sort of point the finger at one person and say, this is your fault. But what I would say is that I think we need much greater accountability for poor performance by, political parties and governments. That if you have under law an expectation that you will do these things for the environment and that we will take care of the environment and so forth, that you actually meet those expectations. And the fact of the matter is we're simply not. You see that with things like recovery plans. We're supposed to have recovery plans for the threatened species. Often they're not written, or even if they're written, they're not funded, and so forth. So we're not meeting our obligations. And another point that I would make too is that often when we think about how we use the environment, the impacts that come after whatever that use is in terms of development are not accounted for. So, things like emissions. So you can undertake a certain development and the emissions are sort of seen as external to the project. So there's a whole range of things that need to change in terms of accountability, again, if we're to see improvement. And of course, many of these things were touched on Professor Graham Samuel's review of the EPBC Act, which made 38 recommendations to actually fix environmental law and importantly enforce it. Because again, laws are only good if you enforce them. And in many, many cases in Australia, they're just not being enforced.
Euan, in 1982, I was in a Year 11 environmental science class. And one of the main themes of that unit was the triple bottom line.
Yes.
The world was going to move towards accounting for the economic damage and the real environmental costs of everything we do. I'm inclined to frame everything in a political way all the time. I reckon everything we do is political. Every choice that we make is political. Have we just been completely steamrolled by that neocon mentality that took root in the late 70s and just has dominated right through until now? And do you think that we may have in some societies had a change of heart where there is now the social license for governments to act in a fairly radical way to shift the balance?
Yeah, there's a lot to answer there. I think I would definitely say that a large part of the issues that we face is absolutely wrapped up in our political system. So until you take away, as an example, political donations, when you have vested interests like from fossil fuel industry and companies, giving over large sums of money to largely our two major political parties, they don't give that money over just for fun. we know it's for a reason, to argue their case. So we do need to make governments more accountable. We need changes to political donations. Of course, people have been screaming out for a federal ICAC to have accountability, because at the end of the day, if we can't trust our leaders' decisions that are being made in a way that is consistent with the abundance of scientific evidence that we have, which we've had for decades, then again, it's unlikely that very little is going to change. And it's funny you're talking about sort of decades ago what you were taught, because I reflect on the fact that in the mid-90s, I was doing my undergraduate studies in James Cook University in Townsville. And I remember vividly Professor Terry Hughes and Professor Steve Williams both warning me about, in the case of Terry, about bleaching events and climate change and what might happen in the future. And Steve Williams warning me about what might happen to some of the wet tropics, so the rainforest species that live in North Queensland as climate change increases, and that they would move up the mountain and or their populations would decline. And I, at the time, thought, this is concerning, but maybe you're being a bit sort of overly dramatic about these things. Turns out they were dead right. Exactly what they said has happened. And in fact, it's happened faster and to a greater degree than, of course, we would like. So that's really confronting for me, that's happened in about a quarter of a century. So really not very long, a little bit over sort of half my life, that profound change that was predicted has happened. So I think there's already huge social license in Australia to make these changes. If you look at surveys about the environment and the fact, how people in Australia feel about the environment, they consistently say that Australians love our wildlife, they love our environments, they want them to be taken care of. We do not see that being reflected in policy. And importantly, also, we don't see that reflected in the media. And I think, of course, we all know that we've had problems with the Murdoch media and so forth, promoting, anti, climate change, sort of misinformation and so forth. So but there's a lot that needs to change.
Let me stop there, because I want to interject on that point too. We always talk about the Murdoch media, the Murdochracy being the problem. The other major dailies are run by Peter Costello, and that's Channel 9 as well, who was the treasurer and the deputy leader in the Howard government. So that's an organ of business. Ida Buttrose is the chair of the ABC. Ida Buttrose, for decades, has been one of the most prominent behind-the-scenes Liberal Party donors. So you've got that. Channel 7 is run by Kerry Stokes, right? Palmer has put so much money into the political system. He's a former national president of the National Party, I think is right. Certainly the Queensland National Party, LNP, and was an advisor to Joe Bjelke-Petersen. So we never actually get to think about the perspective that is being pushed on us. And actually, I want to make a point that illustrates that. Holly, do you watch rugby league in your house on the weekend?
No.
No? Okay. Well, you probably didn't notice this. You were watching footy over the weekend.
Yeah, AFL, not rugby league. I watch real football.
No. Well, I wondered whether this was common in the Sydney telecast.
Probably is, yeah.
But it probably was. National Tree Day, Toyota National Tree Day, Euan. You would have seen that. Not once did I see the date. It was Toyota National Tree Day, National Tree Day, National Tree Day, National Tree Day. But there was no information. And we are now getting greenwashed in a way here. And the retelling of, for every point kicked between this round and that round, Toyota will plant a tree. Okay. But what are they planting? Where are they planting it? Is it a useful addition? Is it going to repair anything? Is it going to serve any ecological function? Botanica has jumped in with, I think it's WWF, saving some some species of plants. This is bullshit. Just stop destroying what's still standing, for crying out loud. There's your opportunity for what we've got to do next, right?
I think the planting trees is interesting because, it's been shown, in fact, that the land clearing rates are outstripping
what we can
tree
replace.
planting, which is largely for carbon abatement. But what I would say, and absolutely following on from what you said about trees, is that we know that for hollow-dependent species, so possums, many of our parrots, some of our reptiles, including like lace monitors and so forth, they depend upon hollows in trees. And those hollows can take 100, 150 years, sometimes longer, to form. And so it's not enough to say, well, we'll plant trees to fix the problem, because even if we plant trees today, it's going to take a long time for those trees to become available to some species. So we absolutely need to conserve what's left, and there's not a lot left in some cases, and also, of course, begin revegetation. But you're right, it needs to be done in a sensitive way. And there are some really interesting things being done in that sense too, in terms of using trees that may be more resilient to climate change, because planting a local tree now may not survive in 10, 20, 30 years. So we might actually have to choose trees that are beyond the current area, which is controversial in itself, because conservation for so long has been saying, choose local, plant local, but now that may not be actually viable. So there's a huge amount that needs to change in terms of, tree planting and revegetation as well.
Holly, on that point, we've had a couple of times the opportunity to speak with Mick Callan about his nest boxes. Now, when I last spoke with Mick, unfortunately you weren't able to join us on that time, we broached the number of hollows, of artificial nest boxes that would need to be provided to be adequate at the moment. And it's hundreds of millions.
And that's not going to help everything, because there are a whole range of wildlife that do not like our nest boxes in whatever shape and form they are coming in at the moment. It's
that's right.
not,
but even
it's
if
the poor cousin, sadly. An nest box is sort of the poor cousin of a natural hollow.
And that was certainly the point Mick was making. But the other point is, Tanya Plibersek was talking about, we're going to put hollows up we're going to put up nest boxes for greater gliders. But as Mick said, the life that you get out of most wooden nest boxes is about 10 years. Yep. Now, Mick's nest boxes, he's looking at them running to about 50 years, maybe longer, but they're $300 a go. And then they've got to be hung and they've got to be monitored. And we need hundreds of millions of them. So, and today, somewhere in New South Wales and somewhere in Queensland, 2 bulldozers are running 40 metres apart with a chain in between them, destroying habitat, and in pristine, or probably not pristine, we probably don't have much of it left anymore, but in suitable forest habitat, we're cutting it down and turning it into toilet paper, and wood chips to be turned into reflex or whatever. So there's the opportunity for what we need to do first, Euan. What's the very first thing we need to do in response to the State of the Environment report?
Look, I honestly don't think there's one thing, and I think the important point is that we can actually do multiple things at once. I think that's a regrettable thing that you often hear in the media, saying, what do we need to do first? Well, actually, we can do multiple things at once. I would say that there's 5 important things that need to happen. The first is that we need to strengthen environmental laws, we need to enforce them, and we need to actually align policy. So it's all well and good, a political party saying, we care about the Great Barrier Reef, we're going to give $1 billion to the Great Barrier Reef, but we're also going to approve coal mines. Those 2 things are incompatible. Same as, of course, having land clearing happening at incredible rates in parts of Australia and then having tree planting exercises. We have policies that are at odds with each other, and therefore one, are not actually solving the environmental problems, and two, are actually costing you more money, because if you're investing in one thing that's causing damage to the environment and then trying to repair the environment at the same time, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The second is actually spending money. So, we have a huge amount of money really in this country relative to, many other countries in the world. We're one of the richest countries per capita in the world. We have this extraordinary wildlife, plants and animals and ecosystems that most of the world is envious of. And yet we don't invest in them. So Professor Brendan Wintle and colleagues estimated that for about $1.7 billion per year, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the federal budget annually, you could recover our listed threatened species. It's estimated we're probably spending about 5% or so on conservation compared to the 95 extra percent that we need. And yet we can still find $100 billion plus for submarines, which we probably don't need. It's quite staggering when you think about it, that, the greatest threat that we face at the moment is not warfare for Australia. The greatest threat that we face at the moment overall is environmental deterioration and collapse. And the best defense for that, of course, is to take care of the environment and invest in it. And I say invest because if we spend money on conserving and recovering species and ecosystems, of course, it's not just beneficial for those species and ecosystems. It generates money for tourism, as an example. So we talked about the Great Barrier Reef before. The Great Barrier Reef is estimated at a minimum to be worth $56 billion. It's worth $6.4 billion, we think, annually for the economy, 64,000 jobs. That's just one example. And then, of course, there's all the intangibles in terms of social benefits, cultural benefits. So spending absolutely has to change. We can't just have goodwill and platitudes. We need to have money to back up our actions.
Can I just jump in there, Euan? Because I saw a figure this morning in one of the headline news stories popping up in the feed.
Yep.
Foot and mouth disease, if it comes in, it might cost 33,000 jobs. That's half the amount of jobs that we're going to lose in a year if we don't fix the problem with the barrier reef.
Correct.
So it goes to the framing again, and who has the mouthpieces, who have the microphones, the megaphones, the front pages. And it's not, I don't know why the tourism industry is not making the noise. It may well be that they were paid off so much during COVID that so many people have got out while they could get a windfall, and they don't care any longer. I don't know. But it just seems crazy that all the B&B, you can always find a gym owner or a cafe owner to talk about mask mandates, but we can't find a B&B owner or a cruise operator to talk about the barrier reef day in, day out.
Yep, it's an interesting question. And in terms of, other things that need to change, an obvious one, of course, is tackling the threats. So we know what the threats are: climate change, habitat destruction and modification, invasive species, feral cats, red foxes, feral horses, deer, rabbits. The list goes on, and many invasive plants. Yeah. Many invasive plants. That was a headline act that I think, or a headline statement, if you like, that really shocked a lot of people with the State Environment Report. There is now more invasive plant species in Australia than there are native plant species. Native plant. That did take me back for a second. And when you think about, I guess, all the escape garden plants, as well as pasture species that have been deliberately introduced for livestock grazing, buffel grass and gamba grass would be two good examples there, that are spreading across northern Australia and are also changing fire regimes in the process, creating hotter, more intense fires over larger areas that then actually means that those areas become unsuitable for other plants and wildlife. That's an example there where, again, we're not aligning policies. We can't have policies to say this is what's considered to be sustainable grazing, which is causing these problems, and then we have these issues for biodiversity. Of course, learning from and working with Indigenous people and First Nations groups has been highlighted again already in this discussion, and that is a key message that needs to change, and that needs to be, of course, self-determined. So we need to move towards, Indigenous people actually running the show. So not we, but Indigenous people actually being in charge of that. And the last thing I would like to say is just to work among and across communities. So we'll often see finger pointing at particular sectors. So people say, oh, it's the farmer's fault for clearing and things like that. We all eat, we all consume. Every choice that we make affects what happens to the environment. And of course, there are many in the agricultural arena that are doing wonderful things. We have, of course, Farmers for Climate Action. We have regenerative agriculture happening. There's great opportunities there. So, we need to move away from sort of assigning blame. And I noticed, of course, this week that there's been a lot of finger pointing at the previous federal Liberal National Party over the last 10 years. But that ignores the fact, of course, that there's huge damage being done at state and local levels by a whole range of political parties and persuasions. So we have the expertise here. We have the goodwill in the community. Again, it's really just leadership that we're yearning for and investment to drive actions. And if we do that, we can solve a lot of problems and create huge opportunities in the process.
To both of you, are you confident that we're going to meet the challenge? Are we going to meet the moment?
Oh, I'd like to say yes. I think we need to see how the government responds to the EPBC changes, what they propose to do, what investment is actually going to come, aside from the report being released and the government saying, oh my goodness, it's really bad. We now need to see some action. And I think until that happens, I'm always going to be a little bit pessimistic. But like Euan said, I think that there is work to be done. There are paths forward, but it needs investment and it needs leadership. And so until we see some runs on the board, it's going to be challenging.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic than I was, and I think in part I'm optimistic because of what happened at the last federal election. There is clearly mood in the voting public for change, and we're seeing, I guess, a more diversified representation in Parliament, and I think that's really important because I'd argue that the two-party system has not served us very well at all, and I think the more we have a diversified Parliament and negotiation about the environment. We saw, in fact, great example of negotiation between the Greens and the Gillard government, and that led to some wonderful changes before that was scuttled by Tony Abbott and his government. But there is great opportunity for political change. And I think, a political party would be not very sensible if they hadn't observed that at the last federal election, and I suspect that will be reflected at state elections. So I think there's clearly a recognition in the public that things are really bad and we need to seriously change our course of direction, because if we don't, we know inevitably where that ends up. So I am hopeful, and I think also I'm hopeful because there are wonderful things happening, within both community groups as well as, of course, by ecologists, environmental scientists and so forth that are happening. So even something like the orange-bellied parrot, which was absolutely on the brink and still is, it's still absolutely precarious. It's still there. And, the hard efforts by researchers and government employees and so forth, community, have been trialling new things for that species and it's been working. The 40 spotted pardalote, again, another species, really ingenious use of insecticides on feathers that they put outside that made available to the parents who are building their nests, that then actually stops a parasitic fly from basically affecting their young, and you have a higher reproductive success. We have novel solutions that we can use. So there's good people doing good things and having good outcomes. So that does give me hope. And I think at the end of the day, if we don't have hope, the alternative is horrendous. So we can't give up, and we have a duty not to give up.
Yeah, and I think following from that too, Euan, there was, the report also, pointed out the importance of community involvement, the importance of citizen science to
Yep.
actually collect some of the monitoring data that we need ongoing. I just want to be sure that the community is being supported by
Absolutely.
a framework that is actually going to deliver something at the end, because we can all go out there and monitor the decline of these guys, as we have of a whole range of species, as we have been doing for a long time. But there needs to be that investment on the other end to actually reward the people that are putting in the effort, that are making the changes on the ground, that are going out and watching their birds or whatever it might be.
Yeah, success breeds success. So, we need to be supporting people who are having good outcomes, because that'll inspire them and others to do more. But if we don't, then we're not going to have the changes that we need.
Again, to both of you, do you think we can rejig the Threatened Species Recovery Hub and make it an effective tool again? Or is it a line in the sand, clean off the whiteboard or the blackboard and start again?
I think the point there is what Holly touched on, and is that conservation is happening everywhere. It's not just one group. So, the Threatened Species Recovery Hub was fantastic, and they achieved a lot of wonderful things. And, myself personally, I contributed to some of those things, and, many colleagues. But conservation is happening everywhere. It's from the person who actually changes, their nature strip from manicured lawn to planted out native plants. It's the person who, lets their grass grow long in their backyard because they know it helps invertebrates. It's people who are campaigning for better environmental laws. It's Indigenous rangers doing wonderful things in Central Australia, Western Australia, Northern Australia, and so forth. So conservation is happening everywhere. So one group, if they don't continue, that's obviously, it's not ideal, but I think conservation is happening everywhere. And importantly, therefore, we need to be encouraging people. And I think we need to be making changes as individuals ourselves, but we do still need to see those changes happening at a higher level, because it is otherwise, it's upsetting when that you're doing your bit and someone else isn't, and you feel like it's all too big and it's all too much to tackle. So I think we need to see both of those things happening and changing. But yeah, it's a shared responsibility.
The reason I brought that up specifically was that there needs to be, I would have thought, some overarching framework that is outside of the Endangered Species Protection Act legislative framework, but there needs to be a funding and administrative and identifying what needs to be done and prioritising when it comes to dishing out money, and that needs to happen. So that was really the point. Did we already have a framework that worked, that cast your mind back 7-8 years ago, that was working, that we can rejig with, that's in a more inclusive manner, or do we just want to allocate money and say administrative support to individual projects? My concern is that everyone's going to be analysing every single dollar in a way that they don't when it goes to joint strike fighters that don't work and ships that can't dock, right? But when it comes to, a PhD candidate existing on 20 grand a year, we got to get value for money. So,
yeah,
do we have an apparatus there that we can make work again?
Yeah, well, 2 points. First of all, we do need to spend a lot more money. We're sort of haggling over the peanuts. So we need to be far more ambitious in that sense. And I'm talking about several billions, not millions or tens of millions. We need to get serious about this, and we're talking about billions, which again is still a tiny fraction of our budget. But importantly, in terms of success, we need to, of course, invest in monitoring what actually happens. And that has been another tragedy of what's happened in recent times, is that money for systematically monitoring through time, what's happening to threatened species, what's happening to ecosystems and so forth, has been stripped away. So we have even these actions that are happening in some cases where there is money to do something, and we have no idea what happened. So we plant trees, which is a good thing to do, and then someone asks a simple question, what happened to biodiversity? And we say, we don't know. Or we say, we poisoned a whole bunch of foxes in this national park, and someone says, what happened? And we say, we don't know. Because there's no monitoring, so we don't have the scientific capacity. So there's people unemployed to monitor, and there's no money to do the actual monitoring. So we need a lot more investment there. It's a big problem. No sensible business would run themselves that way. If you have a private business, you'd want to know what your dollar was doing. But I think we should also not be viewing the environment entirely through a monetary lens.
That's the point. I want people to understand that the way grants have been developed and dished out means that they have a period where they run and then they end. And it might be, for instance, Holly, the team of Powerful Owl watches, monitor an area for 3 years, and on an end date they finish and their data is handed over, and then that's it. Like you said, Euan, no one runs their milk bar or their restaurant like that. But we've put all of our environmental programs into those kind of parameters, which don't work. And I just wanted to reiterate what you said, Euan, and I know I've been banging on about this on social media. We can't get lost in a discussion about climate if we're not talking about biodiversity, food security, water security, and, hey, remember the Hendra virus? That popped out of wildlife. The monkeypox popped up out of there. We don't really know where COVID popped up from. So I know, Holly, you wanted to sort of mention the human health implications. This is all tied in together. And it sounds like a lot of money. But remember, we gave $66 billion through the JobKeeper program to businesses who didn't need it and didn't have to give it back. So anyone who tells you that we can't afford it doesn't know how to read the federal budget. We've got to stop giving money to people who don't need it. We've got to stop subsidising things that are damaging and put the money into things that can repair, in my view, that repair. First, stop the damage. If we have to pay out all the loggers, all the mill owners, all the truck drivers in an industry which is much smaller than the tourism industry associated with the Great Barrier Reef, let's bloody do it. Anyone want to bite?
I was just going to make a quick comment too about, sort of seeing things purely through a monetary lens, is that we know that areas that have more green space and more biodiversity can lead to better mental health outcomes. They can reduce crime rates. They can actually speed up the recovery of people after surgery. You can't put a dollar value on those things, or you can attempt to, but it's kind of farcical to do so. So we know that biodiversity brings people joy. So there's all these things that are beneficial. So I think one of the things that I would love to see is to see the environment genuinely seen as a public good, because that's what it is. It keeps us alive. It keeps us healthy. It drives our economy, has social benefits, cultural benefits. So to not invest in it accordingly is just basically, it's bizarre. It's perverse that we wouldn't do that. And so, we can cite all the examples of contrast with what money we do spend on. That's what needs to change. And so, the health benefits are there. And that was obviously recognised in the State of Environment report too, that air quality and other things that we associated with health are deteriorating. And of course, if that happens, that puts burden on our hospitals, which we're already seeing, of course, due to the pandemic. So again, it comes back economically if you want to quantify it that way, but it's much more than just money.
How did we get from the Franklin, the Gordon below Franklin dam action in the 80s, where a government was prepared to take on a state government with the view that the environment is good. We need the environment. We need a healthy environment. People love the environment. But there doesn't seem to be a government anywhere in Australia that is prepared to act urgently to stop the decline. When is native forest harvesting finishing in Western Australia? It's not next week, is it?
It's not next week.
And clearing koala habitat, or actually clearing mangroves at Toondah Harbour. That hasn't been ruled out for next week, has it, Holly?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
So,
and I think Euan's right. It can be dangerous to view the environment just through a monetary lens, but I think to appeal to, or through a human health lens, I think to appeal to general public who maybe don't think the way that we do, that is absolutely an avenue to get to people. So I think it's one of those tools.
The perspective, I think the point I was trying to make, obviously didn't make it well enough, was that since I was protesting in the streets and going to the People for Nuclear Disarmament and all those marches in the 80s and early 90s, the focus of the man in the street, the average person, the barbecue conversation has shifted away from the environment being great and we all want it and we want it around us to being, how much is it going to cost? How much is it going to cost? So we have to frame it that way from one standpoint, just to appeal to the decision makers. But we need to be strong and active and exert pressure to make them do something. So
yeah, I absolutely agree.
Euan, I saw you looking down, and I'm guessing you need to nick off in a minute.
No, I'm fine.
Oh, good. Well, we got some Facebook love. I just want to acknowledge Jan Martin. Thank you. Can we run through the thought experiment? Because I reckon a lot of people won't have seen this, and I reckon it's really interesting to follow up the way we've just been talking about everything being framed in economics, and that we have what seems to be a farcical situation. But I've got an example where we've already got this kind of stuff happening. So are you happy to do that?
Go for it, Grant.
All right, let's have a look here. People may have seen this is in the conversation. Now let me see. I better go to that page and scroll up. A penguin farm in the Australian desert, a thought experiment that reveals the flaws in our environment law. Professor David Lindenmayer from ANU put this together. Imagine the fictitious scenario. The Federal Environment Minister announces government approval for a large-scale penguin farm near Alice Springs. It will produce 300,000 penguins each year for the high-end feather market in Europe. Penguin feathers are also, in this make-believe world, proven superconductors that could provide an alternative to lithium for renewable energy batteries. The $40 million farming project promises to create jobs and growth in regional Australia. To any uninformed reader or listener, the idea of farming cold ocean seabirds in the Australian desert is mind-numbingly silly. But this hypothetical idea gives us better understanding how environmental governance in Australia has gone badly wrong. The real-world problems were laid bare on Tuesday when the study of environment was released. It showed a devastating loss of plants, animals and habitat on land and in oceans. And without dramatic action, the problem will only get worse. So let's look at the policies that government should fix. Penguins are us. Let's explore the penguin make-believe penguin farm a little further. The venture would use river water to create a new cool aquatic environment for the penguins. Oh, there's one of those in the city of Melbourne. Be located near 2 other large farm projects that also draw water from the river. The proponent, Penguins Are Us, will monitor environment impacts at the site. Environmental groups opposed the plan, but the fictitious Environment Minister said the department thoroughly reviewed the proposal and it represents world best practice in penguin farming. Environmental conditions attached to the project stipulate that water from only one river can be diverted to the project, and the loss of habitat for the endangered orange-throated parrot, a fictitious species invented for the purposes of this example, will be offset by tree planting on a neighbouring pastoral station. Penguins Are Us is a generous donor to major political parties, and the fictitious federal government of the day will provide 50% of the initial finance to get the project up and going. No one yet has proposed this silly farming idea, but all too often a similar script plays out in real life. And then David goes through to talk about weak endangered species protection, which you've highlighted, gross underfunding, which you've highlighted, poor offset process. We didn't really talk about that, but by jingos, that's just a joke. And inadequate environmental monitoring. You were just talking about that, Euan, and problematic political donations. Now, people will look at that and go, but that's ridiculous, Grant. That would never happen. Well, you know how there's not enough enough water in the Murray-Darling Basin for the communities right at the end of it? Did you know we started an almond industry? One of the most water-hungry plant that arguably is already in oversupply in many markets in the world. But we already did this. A stupid, in my view, and I'm a horticulturist, a stupid industry in the wrong place. We've already put penguins in zoos. We know how to keep them cool and happy, and in some places get them breeding. Why not? It's going to be closely monitored. It's world's best practice. And, I mean, offsets. Here's my stupid example. Imagine that the dodo, and that the dodo is my logo, that the dodo was rediscovered on some Pacific or Atlantic Ocean island, and it was doing okay. It was hanging on. It's been going for 600-700 years. No one's disturbed it. But there's lithium on the island. So they've decided to mine the island. But that's okay, because the company also has the rights to another island. It's only 7,000 kilometres to the west. There's no lithium there. That's the offset. We're going to offset this one. Well, how are the dodos going to get there? Are there any dodos on this other island? Are there? The system, the whole thing is farcical, but it's happening now.
Yeah, I think few in the environmental sphere would argue with you about the deeply problematic concept of offsets, and a term that I've never understood myself, this concept of no net loss on a finite planet. I'm still trying to get my head around it. I've got wonderful colleagues like Dr. Megan Evans, Martine Moron as well, and others who have waxed lyrical about the issues with offsets for many years, and just how utterly absurd some of these offsets are, if you can even find data on what happened. In most cases, you can't, because no one actually monitored what happened after an offset was supposedly put in place. It's really upsetting, obviously, and I think it just highlights again the point David's making is that just we have these economic and environmental instruments supposedly in place, but when you strip them away and actually look at what's going on, it's utterly absurd.
One of the big problems that we've developed in the last probably 20 years is a proposal like this comes up and they go, wouldn't this industry be great? Look at all the benefits. But it's not a good enough industry for you to be able to attract 100% funding to make it go. So what we want is we want to own it and get all the profits from it, but we'd like the government to give us half of the startup. And this is happening over and over and over again. But we're still making researchers live on 20 grand a year. It's nutso, bonkers.
No arguments, Grant.
Nope, none from me.
Okay, I just want to finish with one point, Euan, going back to where we were talking about who's to blame or who owns it or whatever. I don't want to attach blame because I think we're past that. But let's just reflect on who some of the environment ministers were in the last government. Josh Frydenberg, who was the treasurer in the last government, and Greg Hunt, who was the health minister. Now, I thought that you got promoted to really important jobs for doing a good job. Now, I don't think that anyone can say that either of those did a good job as the environment minister. But there we go. There. So, what I want to contend, and you can leave it alone if you want. Knowing everything we know now, the report's out, it's been laid bare, the pollies have done the media rounds telling us all about how bad it is and they've committed we're going to do the action, blah, blah, blah. So does that mean that now Tanya Plibersek may not be to blame for what's happened, but she now bears the responsibility and carries the can for making this work? Are we going to be ruthless enough to sheet that responsibility back to one person so that action actually happens?
Well, first of all, I would say that responsibility needs to happen at multiple levels. So Tanya, of course, is responsible federally, but as we all know, a lot of environmental responsibility actions and impacts happen at local government level and state and territory government level. So it would be unfair to actually point it at one person. But we do need to see accountability across those levels.
Though, because what do we say on TV? With all due respect.
With respect, that's right.
Yeah. I reckon that's a cop-out nowadays because the federal government's got all the money, and if they wanted to stop the damage, they could do moratorium. They do it in all sorts of things when it works. And if there's compensation that's required to stop something happening, you pay the compensation. So states have been overridden in so many examples by the feds. I don't see why it's different now. I reckon that the powers are there, provided that compensation is paid, to actually get rid of the regional forest agreements. When's the last time that you saw a wheelwright? You know, where are all the Cobb and Co stagecoach mechanics? Industries reach maturity and end, right? There's no biplane hangars at Tullamarine Airport or at Mascot servicing biplanes because we don't have them anymore. So I think we need to actually force action. I don't know how we do it. That's the problem. I don't know how we do it. But one person, well, she's the figurehead in a government that have the power and have the money to do it. That's my view.
I'm absolutely in agreement that we need accountability. And in fact, I think myself and many of us were outraged that the former Minister for Environment, Susan Lee, and her government went to court to contest a duty of care to children to act on climate change and to not do things basically that would contribute to a worsening climate. So that to me is a really stark example of just how unaccountable some of our leaders are and our governments are. So we absolutely need to see more accountability. I think, most of the public is screaming out for that. So I don't for a second think that an environment minister shouldn't be held to account. I think what you're getting at is that we do need substantial change across governments and governance. And unless we do that, there's no expectation that things will vastly improve. So we do need to see that. There's a lot that needs to change.
And I think having one person as the person who is held accountable lets all those other guys off.
Absolutely.
It lets the state government, planning ministers, environment ministers get away with it at local government level as well. I think there needs to be that framework of accountability. Absolutely, she's figurehead at that federal level, but I think that allows a pass for those guys who are on the ground doing a lot of causing a lot of these issues.
And even within the ministry, I think it's important to recognise, if you look back through time, the environment minister is very rarely given much sort of power, if you like, within cabinet and compared to other ministries. So until the environment minister is elevated to a point where they can actually say to someone who's concerned with development, actually, no, you can't do that, and we're not going to do that because this is what it's going to do to the reef. Then again, it's unfair in a sense, because they're on a hiding to nothing, because they might have all the best scientific evidence and ideas in mind, and they're overridden by their own party and their own cabinet.
And I sort of alluded to that earlier on when I talked about the makeup of these ministries. It's problematic in every jurisdiction.
Yep.
And people need to also be aware at local governments are stacked with developers. And then the local media invent the greenie versus committed councillor, the war, which is counterproductive, but it always happens. And to your point there too, Euan, I give you Peter Garrett. Nobody rode a greater public wave. He could have done whatever he wanted had the government let him do it. But he was hung out to dry. Absolutely hung out to dry. Let's find a ray of hope. Holly, tell us about something really, really, really good that you can talk about. That's going
from the
on.
report, or that's going on?
No, that's going on. I don't think there's anything really good in the report, but one of the things that we need to lean on, that the report tells us, is citizen science and people being involved. So tell us a good thing that people can get involved in now to make a difference and improve the state of the environment.
Oh, look, there are so many opportunities out there in BirdLife and in community organisations and research projects all around the country. So, of course, we've got bird nerds here who are keen to do bird stuff. And so, for example, we just opened up another round of our Gang cockatoo recovery project, where we're basically educating people on the ground about gangs, getting them to monitor and providing them with the framework to take their own action on their own space for gangs. So that's really exciting. And, we've got about 200 people that have just opened up to do this round. So I'm really excited to hear what actions they're going to take on their own spaces. What else is there? We've just had a blitz with local councils on the rodenticide issue at Birdlife. So we've had a huge number of people contacting their local councils, asking them what they do in terms of first or second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, and asking them if they do use second gens to make a switch. That finished last week. And so we've got some great councils who have said, hey, we're already doing this, or we're keen to phase out the use of second gen poisons. So that's been really, really exciting. And from that, there's been some community groups that have come on board who want to start working on the issue in their local community as well. So, you know, there's ways that people can contribute to large scale threatened species recovery, or, you know, become active in their local community to do things. And you can always, you know, we've talked about, you know, not being able to offset the damage of habitat loss. But like Euan said, you can get out there and plant. There are always ways you can green up your space and make it more attractive to wildlife in your local area.
We did an episode about that, Holly, didn't we?
We did.
We've actually done a couple about that. So,
Funny that.
And you'll find them on thebirdemergency.com/Holly. If you scroll back, you'll actually see them there.
Yeah. So, I mean, people can, sorry, I'll just finish up. There's people that, you know, we want to be lobbying and campaigning to the feds after this report. And so there are ways through BirdLife, you know, you can do that. But we also want people to take joy in their local wildlife as well. And while it is very doom and gloom, there are things you can do in your own space in advocacy and in habitat creation, and that can be putting in some plants. It can be putting in a bird bath or a frog pond. It could be a nature strip. There's a whole range of things to do, and I think it's probably a good time to take a bit of solace as well for your own mental health in taking some of those actions, and controlling I guess it's about controlling your own space and what you can contribute at a local level. And it's probably a really good time to do that, I think.
And follow that link, go to the Birds in Backyard site, and you can do a survey in your own backyard, which contributes to Holly's database to understand what's happening with the birds in the urban environment.
That's right.
Euan, what's happening at your school at Deakin? What are some of the great projects that are being undertaken now?
In terms of my own research group, or
you can be as broad or as narrow as you like, because one of the things I always like to push with this show is that research often disappears behind a paywall into a journal, but people need to know what's being done, and then they need to hear what happened and what we discovered.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say that we're really lucky at Deakin that we do have a really sort of hands-on approach to wildlife ecology and conservation. And our undergraduate students spend considerable time in the field, you know, learning about wildlife, you know, getting their hands dirty, going to all sorts of amazing environments and doing that. But in terms of our researchers as well, including honours students and PhD students and so forth, yes, we're doing wonderful work, whether it be up in the Mallee, looking at the role of dingoes in the landscape, whether it be in the Strathbogie Ranges, looking at the value of roadside areas for conserving arboreal mammals, including greater gliders, a threatened species. You know, people wouldn't realise that in, you know, northeast Victoria, along really tiny sections of road, about 500 metres long, really thin, might be 10 metres, there can be up to 9 to 10 arboreal mammals, which a lot of people exactly raise their eyebrows when I say that. And that includes greater gliders, koalas, you know, a whole range of species. But we also invest considerable amounts of time sharing that information on things like social media. So, you know, a student, Luke Emerson, wrote recently about greater gliders with Darcy Watchthorne as well. You know, and we've got, of course, Mammal of the Year contest that has come out, and that's not really about who wins. It's about promoting understanding of all these mammals, and particularly species that are not well known to people. So there's a whole range of things that we can do and should do to really help address this issue. And I think what I like about Holly's examples are they're things that individuals can do, and particularly at a local scale, that scale up. And so one of the best things that I think I've done personally in recent times is, as I said before, right at the start, was change my nature strip from lawn to a whole bunch of native plants. And what I love almost most about that is that often when I'm out there sort of pulling out a couple of weeds or doing a few things here and there, someone will walk past me and say, oh, this is so beautiful and it's so wonderful. And, how did you do it? Was it really hard to do? And I talked them through the process of how to actually convert their own nature strip into something quite different that I think looks much better. I don't have to mow the lawn anymore. That's a big win. And of course has all these benefits for invertebrates and birds and so forth. And that promotes, I think, this sort of connection with the environment. And of course, those people will then go on to do some similar actions, and they might also then actually start asking questions of some of our leaders and saying, well, I like these things. What are you doing to take care of them? So, our whole concept of sort of think global, but act local, which has been around for a long time, it's really true, that motivating individuals in a way that, they can do things on their terms, because not everyone has the same opportunities, the same set of circumstances in terms of what they can influence. That's really critical, but we can all actually play a part. So, yeah, there's a whole range of great things, but I think, as you say, Grant, really sharing that with as many people as possible in different ways, social media channels and shows like yourself that you've got here, it's really, really important. And to be proactive and to empower people, because the conservation world is full of doom and gloom based on what's happening, but we don't want that to override everything to the point that we become apathetic and just completely defeated by it, because now more than ever, we need to be actually showing people what can be done, what should be done, and, the potential benefits of doing so.
Yeah, I don't think we celebrate our successes enough, really.
No, well, and in fact, worse than that, in many cases, including the scientific community, is terrible at punishing people for, inverted commas, failures. And one of the issues in conservation is that, there's that sort of saying that goes around, which may or may not have been from Einstein. No one really knows. But, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And, there are scientists that have been pushing the envelope and trying different things. And sometimes it works brilliantly. Sometimes it doesn't. And then you'll see people sort of pile on and say, oh, you never should have done that because it was never going to work. And I find that disappointing, because if we don't actually try different things, and things are sometimes quite left of, field, then we're not going to see big changes. So I think we need to do a better job, even within the sort of conservation community, of actually backing people in, including government too, because, I've got many colleagues who work for government agencies and they would like to do things differently, but they know if they try something risky and it doesn't come off, they'll get punished for it, much more so than maybe an academic does. So I think we need to do a much better job also of supporting people, even when things don't go to a plan, because, science is about experiments, trying things, observing, learning, and then repeat. And even when we don't have things go exactly how we like, we can still learn from that. And this whole concept of adaptive management, which is basically trying different actions, measuring them. If it's good, keep doing more of that. If it's not quite the way we'd like it, tweak it, change it, and then do something different, and then again measure. So, we absolutely need to, one, celebrate successes, but two, even encourage people, even when things don't go to plan.
That thing about learning from your failures and adapting was something we discussed with Simon Verdon with his project with the translocation of the Mallee emu wren.
Yep.
As Simon said, that if you evaluate that project on its own, it was a failure. But they've adapted and they've learned, and the recovery teams and other groups that are looking at relocations, translocations, reintroductions, learned a lot from that process. So everything's good. So I just want to say a couple of things so that people don't get the wrong idea about what I'm on about. I'm not against Tanya Plibersek, so let's not get that in. I'm on team Tanya, but she's got the job. She's put her hand up for it. She didn't say to the Prime Minister, no, I'd prefer not to have that. And she's made some bold statements. So that's why I think the acid is now on her. So that's my standpoint there. So I just want people to be clear about that before I get the pile on Twitter again. I'm not against Team Tanya, but somebody's sitting in that chair, and the person in that chair has to do stuff, not talk about stuff.
I think it's fair to say that we've come off a very low base, and we do expect a lot better performance in that portfolio. That's just a statement of fact.
But it's also more than that, Euan, I think. It's not what we expect. It's what the environment, it's what the creatures, it's what the soil needs. It's what the rivers
100%.
need.
No argument.
So we can't go, it's just not enough. I think was it in the piece that James Watson, I think, put out over the weekend, that failure's not an option. We don't get a do-over on this.
No, there's no planet B.
Exactly right. Euan, this is where I turn into a shill. Actually, first I want to say, before we wrap up, if anybody has a comment they want to make or a question they want to ask from the socials, from the Facebook or from the Twitch, now's the time. Hey, I don't have a day job like Holly and Euan. I produce stuff just about every day so that I can amplify our allies, to push the good news, to help people see the joy in birds, and help people like Richard Sinclair and Dan Nugent and Kat Young and everyone who's Claire Greenwell and everybody who's out there doing work to get their message out. So, buy me a coffee. There we go. I'm shilling. If you don't want to do that, because it does cost money to do streaming and have a website and have the internet and all that kind of stuff. But the other way you can help, it's really easy. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, because when I reach certain milestones, I can do extra things which will make my life easier. I'd really like it to I'd like to put a lot more stuff out there and talk to people like Euan and Holly all the time. And sometimes being able to get to certain milestones on certain platforms makes it easier to do those things. So there we go. Shilling over. Holly, I'll put this one up again. What can people be looking at Birds in Backyards at the moment? What's the latest?
Oh, well, so they can go on and learn about how to do a Birds in Backyard survey. Like we said earlier, Grant, you can tell me all about the birds that you've got in your space and what your garden is like. We're doing some great analysis at the moment to, give people some good information on how they can better create bird-friendly spaces. You can also, if you have a child at school, or you are a teacher, where we've got our Birds in Schools program that's active and actively looking for schools to take part. So that's for primary schools who want to learn about the birds on their school ground, survey birds on their school grounds, and have the kids control and take action for birds on their school grounds as well. So you can get information on the Birds in Backyards website.
That sounds like something I need to chase you up on, Holly, because
It does.
I haven't mentioned this to you yet, but Sundays we're going to start. Not you. I don't need you to be available on a Sunday, Holly. But on Sunday, we're going to do sharing your yard list or your patch list.
Nice.
So we do a bit
Good
more
one.
sort of bird watchy stuff, and we make it a bit more about the joys of bird watching, Euan, because the doom strolling can get pretty intense. So that's going to be starting up fairly soon on a Sunday. It will be like get a coffee, get a croissant, sit down and hear someone talk about the joys that they get from watching the birds in their home patch. You're not a bird lister, are you, Euan?
Oh, I'm a bird watcher. I would never call myself a twitcher. That's where I put the distinction. But no, I like to consider myself an all-rounder. I very much enjoy going out wherever it is and seeing as many different species, whatever group it is. So I've been all over different parts of Australia looking at wonderful birds, Gordian finches, palm cockatoos, golden shoulder parrots are some of the wonderful ones I've seen. So I've been lucky, but I enjoy it all.
we have to rename the palm cockatoo. Isn't it the palm rockatoo for the Commonwealth Games mascot?
Yeah, that's been put forward by Christina and many others. So it would be a great choice. There's not many animals in the that can play musical instruments like a palm cockatoo can. So they're pretty awesome.
Yeah, definitely. So you don't keep a list as such of your.
I used to keep a list actually, but I haven't for a
Okay.
long time.
Right,
I know that I've seen over 500 birds in Australia, which I think is pretty good going. But I don't keep a list anymore. No.
Well, start keeping a list for your backyard or for your daily walk, and we'll invite you on. Holly, are you going to discuss your list? The other thing too, Euan, just so you both know, we can record it on a different day, and I can then play it on a Sunday. So, but the live Sunday sessions are going to be very relaxed.
The magic of the pre-record.
Yeah, well, but I prefer doing it live because I want to have some fun.
It's more fun.
Because, boy, jingos. Now, before we go, everybody, apart from getting involved in citizen science and whatnot, when you're on social media or when you're on Facebook or whatever, amplify the allies. Okay, this is really, really important. The people who are consistent in their messaging and are influential, I don't mean influencers, they're influencers, amplify their message, because that seems to be about 50% of how the officers in all range of government and administrative positions decide whether they'll get interested in something. So retweet, share, like, comment, do all that kind of stuff, and let's make a difference, because it's our last chance, our absolute last chance. Right, Euan, tell us what people should do to follow you, to check you out, and any of the other great people in your orbit, in the Deakin orbit.
Well, in the Deakin orbit, there's plenty of people. Nick Porch actually is a really interesting person to follow, because he posts a lot of photos about invertebrates, which is a group, of course, that does not get anywhere near the amount of love and recognition that they should. He posts extraordinary photos on Twitter. So look up Nick Porch. There's John White does, research on small mammals, including rodents, which is a group of mammals, again, that doesn't get as much love as they should. There's so many people, and I sort of don't want to just mention, a few individuals, because there are so many
someone
people.
Will get missed out.
Yeah, well, there literally is so many people that talk about the environment on Twitter. This morning I was actually on Life Matters with Kylie Soanes from University of Melbourne, and she's an absolutely wonderful champion for
Friend of the show.
Wildlife, for urban biodiversity. Dr. Megan Evans, Aisha Tulloch, I could go on and on and on. Dave Watson, it's a long list about people who are doing a wonderful job. Yeah, I spend a lot of time on Twitter doing exactly what you're saying, Grant. Putting out some of my own content, but also amplifying the messages of others, because, as you say, that's critical. Communication is it's a two-way thing, and I think a lot of people need to remember that. If you're just putting out your own content one way, that's broadcasting. It's not communication. Communication is being actively interested and engaging with what others have to say. So I think that's a really important thing. So yeah, hence why I spend considerable time on things like Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and so forth. So I think find the biodiversity champions out there and help them raise their profile.
Absolutely. Euan, it's been great to be able to get you on the show. It's because you're the all-rounder and the mammal guy. It's been hard to shoehorn you into the bird emergency, but I'm really pleased that we were able.
I will quickly say that my very first start in research, my honours project, was actually on birds. A wonderful little bird called the golden-headed cisticola. or cisticola, some people
Yeah.
pronounce it. And that was actually my honours project. So I did start on birds.
There you go.
Actually, I meant
Always
to
a
ask
connection.
you. I meant to ask you, Euan, were you
Yep.
up at Townsville in '94?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And did you hang out at the Parmetum?
I did occasionally, and I should actually say that my wife and I got married at the Parmetum in Townsville.
Well,
so it's a special place for us.
I did see that. I did my horticulture placement at Townsville City Council and the Parmetum and the Strand and the nursery and the bot gardens there and whatnot. So,
Townsville holds a special place in my heart and my wife's heart as well. So it's a wonderful place. And in fact, the whole region, of course. But yeah.
Dr. Holly Parsons, thanks again. Every second
Thanks,
Monday, thebirdemergency.com/Holly. You'll see us doing this with somebody talking about something. Tuesday, bonus episode comes out. Wednesday, the proper scientific episode comes out. Thursdays, we're going back to Tour Guide Thursdays shortly, where you'll meet more people who are involved in showing people the joys of watching wildlife, watching birds, and some great places to get out into nature. Fridays, Photography Fridays. Saturday, that's going to be Seabird Saturday shortly. And I just told you about Sunday. So, boy, there's never enough bird stuff to talk about. Thanks, Euan. Thanks, Holly. I'm Grant
Thank
Williams.
you.
I'm a bird nerd. This has been the Bird Emergency. Thanks for joining us. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. See ya.